Okay, so we're going to look at the MMC, how we can manipulate. Web enrollment is something that that's the bit that's kind of missing in the set of exercises we have. So I do want to talk about that a little more. It comes up with IIS and any kind of web server. Typically, that's where you're going to use it a lot. But also for any kind of manual request, this could be kind of handy. Okay, it's not the only way to do it. So we've actually focused on other ones, but I found that there was a gap here because I'd assumed that it was covered in more fully in web server. So I'm just going to patch that little gap up. Auto enrollment and enrollment. So basically, one of them is supposed to be low intervention, the other one is a manual process. If auto enrollment fails, you can always fall back to enrollment. Okay, that's always an option that's available, assuming you've configured it right. And I'll apologize right now. I've got some allergies, just seasonal allergies. I think I've sneezed everything out that I need to sneeze, but that's still I'm a little gummed up now, so I'm a little verklempt. Okay, so what's a certificate template? It's really exactly what it sounds like. It's what you use as a read-only, source, kind of like a VM template, to create other templates. So you set it up the way that you want this particular template, and then people can just copy off of it. Okay. Now, they can't just copy off of it. Once you set up the template, you also have to publish it and make it available for people to use. So typically what we do is Microsoft gives us a bunch of templates to start out with, which they think this might be useful to you. Then what we usually do is clone the template, modify it so that it has the features that we want, okay? And then we publish the copy that we made. And that copy is a new template, kind of suited for our environment. So a certificate template just there's different purposes. You could have a template for a web server. You can have a template for any random host on the network. You could have a template for any user on the network, right? You could have a template just for VPN servers, which I think we do an exercise on that, okay? So, basically the name of your template, you want to make sure that it's descriptive so that people understand what it is they're cloning off of, essentially. So, some options that you have with a certificate template is to duplicate it if you want to use it as kind of a source to create another template. But you can also, then you modify it, give it a new name, and then issue it out. That's the publishing part. Okay? That's usually the process that you'll follow. Once you've issued a certificate of your template of your own, you can actually create duplicates of that as well and continue on. You can re-enroll all certificate holders. So if they're already enrolled and then their certificate is expiring or there's a problem with it, it's possible to request a new one, delete the old one. That's often a troubleshooting feature that we use. Okay, it's not always the best option. It's not the first thing you go to, but it can help. So some example templates, the digital signature. This would be for signing code, for example, if you're a coder. Okay. Server authentication. So if you want you're an admin, you want to set up remote desktop, but you want it so that only servers with certificates can be connected to. You set that up in group policy. Then each server is going to need a certificate, and so that it can prove that it is who it claims to be. And you can also do client authentication. That's a little less common, but in ultra secure circumstances, you do want that, right? Like banking, for example. But you could even have client system authentication if you choose to. Okay. Now, I'm just going to go to the MMC here for a second. That's not what we're looking at here, but I just want to kind of, nope, that's not what I wanted. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so if you just launch MMC, which you're well familiar with by now, I imagine. Add, remove, snap-on. We go to the certificate section. We add that, and I'll just add my user. I think I did this for you guys before. And then you can also add a computer account. We don't tend to deal with service accounts, but you can. It's just not as common. Okay. Okay, so when you're poking around in here, there's different areas where certificates can be stored. As a current user, I might have personal certificates, right? Those are just for me. They have nothing to do with the system, but they are on this particular system that I'm on, right? So essentially, it's saying the mSaunder that's logged in here uses this cert for the encrypted file system, and it uses this cert for the smart card logon. Okay, so if I want to, I can double click into any one of these, and I can poke around and look at the details. Okay. I could, if I wanted to, delete it, right? I can also export it. So if I go back into the properties, let me see. No, that's not what I wanted. Oh, let me double click. Yeah. I can go copy to file, and I can export the certificate either with the private key or without the private key. Okay. Now, if I export with the private key, I better not share that with anybody, right? So the only reason you're doing that is if you're trying to set it up somewhere in a secure manner. You're not emailing this out. You're not giving it to a random stranger. Normally, if you export without the private key, then that's something that you can safely share with other people. Okay. In fact, they're going to be requesting that certificate often from you in point of daily practice, let's say. Now, there are different types of encoding that you can use to export your file, and the reason is it's binary. Okay, so it's not something that you're going to open up and be able to just read. It's going to be encoded typically in base 64. That's the common one. DER encoded is essentially what we're seeing here. Okay, so we've got this GUI interface which is reading a DER encoded certificate, and it's kind of presenting it to us in a nice way. But just to say, there are different ways to do this. Linux favors one type, Windows favors another. They're all usable, okay? And you can convert between them and stuff like that. Okay, now on the local machine, the local machine also has personal certs, right? Which are just unique to the machine itself. It has nothing to do with the user in particular. But those can still be useful. For example, NVIDIA has inserted something which I don't particularly use, but basically a certificate for this machine to talk to the GameStream server. Okay. Now, if you look here, there's a Trusted Root Certification Authority section. This is where all the big daddies are. Okay, so any kind of top hierarchy CA is going to be placed here. So you'll see there's DigiCert, there's going to be Microsoft for sure, there's GoDaddy, Global Sign Entrust, quite a few, Symantec, they're big ones too. VeriSign is down here. The idea being Microsoft has pre-populated a lot of our systems with certs that they expect that we should trust. If you don't want to trust those, you're going to have some problems, but if you're really in an environment where you want to lock things down, you can actually delete these if you choose to. It's not recommended, okay? But it is something that you can do. Down here, we have enterprise trust, and that's where really a lot of your subordinate CA, things like that, all of that's going to go in here. And as well, they might show up in your intermediate CAs. So when we set up our subordinate, it's an intermediate because it's not the top of the hierarchy, right? So our offline is going to show up here in certificates, and our sub CA is going to show up here. Sometimes they show up in more than one location. If you don't tell MMC, it just makes a guess, and it might put it in more than one place, okay, if it's not too sure. So just so you know, this is a main area where we go to troubleshoot problems. Now, this interface here is part of the certificate services interface. So this is not a client thing. This is a server thing, right? These are all the templates that are available that Microsoft just kind of decides, oh, you might find it useful. Okay. There are the odd occasions where you set up your CA and it doesn't have any of these. The templates aren't visible. That could be a little bit awkward because then you're like, well, what am I duplicating off of? You can actually recover them. It's just you'll get a subset instead of the full listing, and then you just got to work with that if that's the case. Okay, but they can always be recreated if you need to. Okay, but these are the templates that we start with, and then we build from there. We never actually use these templates themselves. We always clone them, then we change the clones, then we issue the clones, okay, so that other people can use them. So nobody, I mean, there are some of these which we make available, but most of them we'll want to customize ourselves, and that's the recommended practice. Okay, so you'll be building a sample template in the exercises quite a bit. But basically, the first thing that you do is you duplicate a template, then you open up that duplicate. It's going to be given the name copy of, okay? And then you just change it to something that's appropriate. So if you're working with other people, you want that to be well communicated, right? You want to explain exactly what this certificate is meant to be used for. Display name is a good place to do that. Okay. Now, some other things, when you're creating a subject name, that's essentially who's requesting the certificate. So when the template is being used, you don't have a particular user in mind or a particular system. You have to have a pattern for building the name that's going to be the subject name. Okay. So one option, you could either ask them to supply it in the request, but you can also, if you're doing auto enrollment, you don't want to ask a question, right? So you're going to say, I want to build this from Active Directory. And then you can use features in Active Directory. So the DNS name of the server, say, the DNS name of a user, or the email name of a user, which should be pretty much the same thing. But there are other options that you can supply. Okay. And so that can make a difference for whatever function you're trying to achieve. Like, let's say in email, if we want people to have digital certificates to send mail, having an email in your Active Directory is important. So if you're going to automatically build it from Active Directory and the user account doesn't have an email name, then the auto enrollment process would fail, right? And then you have to go back, massage the user, and then try again. Okay. Same thing with DNS names. There should be something there that you can work on. Just because if it's part of Active Directory, it's got to have a DNS name. If it's not part of Active Directory, it won't be able to actually engage in this process in the first place. Now, a common error that people make is not setting up security on the templates. And so these are the kind of the typical entities that you're going to see. You want to make sure if it's a certificate that everybody's supposed to have access to, or if the template is supposed to be available to everyone, you want to make sure that authenticated users has read access. You don't necessarily want to give them write access because then they can modify the template, right? But they can read off of it in order to create their own copy. That's the idea. So sometimes people will be like, look, I did all this work and my user can't find the template, even though I issued it, right? Well, if authenticated users don't have access to it, it's not going to present to you as an option. So permissions are something to keep in mind. Domain admins should always have full access. Domain computers should probably have read access, but not always. It depends on the cert. If it's just a user cert, there's no particular need for that. Enterprise admins should always have full access. Okay. Now you see down here, there's full control. That's what I meant by full access. There's read. There's write. There's enroll. That's another one that you want to give to authenticated users. Okay. And then there's auto enroll. You don't necessarily turn that on. It depends whether you want to automate the process so that all users within a group policy OU are going to have access and be able to automatically have a certificate. Okay, so if you don't turn this on, auto enrollment won't work for the user, but they can still manually enroll themselves. So those are just some troubleshooting things to watch out for. Okay, happens quite a bit. Another issue that pops up is that they always present you with really old certificate templates. Okay, so if you go to compatibility and you look and see what level of cert authority that this is being issued for, Windows Server 2003 is very old school. There's been a lot of changes since then. Okay, it's almost always useful to upgrade this to at least Windows Server 2016. Okay. Your mileage may vary. There could be niche circumstances where that's not true, but really you want to change this drop down for both the certification authority and the recipient, and make that pretty recent. I'd say 2016 is good. I don't even think they have templates for 2019 right now. Okay. And then once you've made all those configurations on the template, that allows people to actually access it, except that you still have to make it available. You have to publish it. Okay. So they may have permissions, but they can't find it yet. Once you right click onto a particular, you go here, new certificate template to issue. It'll let you choose which one you want to make available, and then you just select it. Then people will be able to see it, and then auto enrollment starts to kick off. Okay. Now I talked a little bit about trusted root certificates in the MMC, right? These are just the really crucial certificates that are installed by default or that are at the top of the hierarchy in your own organization. Okay, so where do these come from? Microsoft gives them to us, and they're the ones who have gathered it from other sources. Okay, so these are meant to be built on the trust that you have for Microsoft. Really, they're like, trust us. This is, we built this OS. These are needed, right? Now, how do we build trust on a private CA? Well, if we build our own CA, we're going to put it in trusted root certificates. And that's where the offline CA is going to go. Okay. And we're done. Okay, so certificate enrollment, you get a chance now to work on it. Okay. Don't worry too much about the theory here, but it's a good thing just to ask yourself whether you understand what you're doing. This is not like quiz material. It's, do I understand what I'm talking about material? Okay. So I would say after you do the exercises, go back to this and see if you can answer all these questions. That'll give you a bit of a sense of whether you really understood what you just did. Okay. Now, web enrollment is a separate topic. It's a separate process, really. But this is just enrollment with IIS. So you go through a web interface. It is a little bit confusing. Just because there's a lot of features in there, and a lot of it is encoded. So when it's asking you for stuff, it's asking for it in encoded form. You have to copy and paste it from a document, but you don't actually know what you're providing exactly, So if you set up web enrollment, IIS will be there, and you'll have this link, whatever your server name is, and there's a virtual directory called CertServe, right? And there you're going to be asked to authenticate. You provide your information, so you have to have the appropriate rights to get in. And then you can actually say, look, I want to create a request. That's one option. The other one is I have a request and I want to submit it to the CA for a manual approval. Okay. And then when that's done, you can then go over as an administrator to the certificate services interface, and you can approve it. Okay. Once it's approved, the user, the client, can then go back to the website and check and see whether they've got an issued certificate, and they can download it and install it for their use. It is a little awkward, and sometimes you're often playing both the client and the administrator at the same time, just because most of the time users don't know how to work with this. Okay, but there are times when like a junior or tech may go through web enrollment to get a certificate, and you're the administrator who's giving it to them, and you're making sure that they're doing it right. You know, um, it is limited functionality, but on the other hand, sometimes it's the best way to go forward, and I would say often with web servers, it's a good way to go. So manually launching certificates, the MMC, I already talked about that, really. CertLM.MSC, that's just the local machine. So I use MMC add remove snap-in, right? But you can actually type CertLM.MSC, and that'll just take you to the local machine console. Cert Manager, CertMGR.MSC, will give you your local user configuration. I just use MMC to load them both into the same pane, right? So, choose your poison. If you just like typing in that command line stuff and getting straight to where you want to go, that's actually fewer clicks. And then you might want to commit that to memory, but it's not really something, it's really just a matter of your preference. Okay? It's not a better way to do it or anything like that. Okay, certificate auto enrollment. That's just making sure that, processes that are prone to failure when you involve users can be streamlined, So rather than making everybody go through a manual process and requiring an administrator to be like, approve, 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 they have enabled it pretty simply so that you can just go into group policy, enable the feature for a particular purpose and say, everybody in this OU, they're automatically going to get something. It doesn't work 100% of the time, but it does work 98% of the time. That 2% often is at the start. When you're first setting it up, that's when it's least likely to work. And then afterwards, it usually comes around. It's just some delay in Active Directory. So this is not going to work. If you're encountering that's not working, and you're like, oh, it's the 2%, I just have to wait it out, and then you're waiting and then it's still not working, then you got to get into some troubleshooting, right? So auto enrollment needs to be turned on. That permission that we talked about earlier, I'll just go back right here. This is one that you want to make sure is enabled, because if it's not, group policy won't work. Okay, it'll try, but it won't have the ability to auto enroll, and so it will fail. Your group policy, you want to make sure that it's being picked up by the client, okay, whether that's the user or whether that's the computer. So you want to do some kind of GP update /force. You're familiar with that. And then there could be, a lot of different causes. Like I said, versioning can be a problem. You might have created a template that's not appropriate for the purpose, or it might be missing crucial information. Okay. So when you're troubleshooting, you do the simple things first, right? GP update /force, that takes no time. And it's either going to work or it's not, So that's, even though you might be like, okay, I don't really think this is a problem with updating the group policy, try it, because it's not going to take much. It doesn't cost you much, okay? MMC can give you a lot of information, especially if it's producing errors. So if you go into your MMC and you make a request, and then this error pops up and it says, hey, I can't, you don't have permission to access this particular template. Then you got to go over to the console for administration, and you go and you check the permissions of the template. Okay. There's also the failed certificates request folder in the CA. So when you're doing auto enrollment, if something goes wrong, the ones that fail will get put into a separate folder, a junk bin, and you can kind of look into those just to see if there's anything that sticks out that might explain why it failed. Okay. There's the issued certificate request folder just to check. So if someone's like, I can't get this to work, and you go in and you see that they've got an issued cert, then you know that it's not a problem with the server side. It's going to be an issue with their integration of it on their side, right? And then if there's any required certificate values missing, now that's a little more subtle. You're going to have to watch for that a little bit. And the best example I can give you for that is in Exchange. if you don't have a user with an email address, they're not going to be able to request a certificate for email. Okay. It's pretty obvious, but when you're actually analyzing it, it may not stick out to you. Okay. So just something to think of is like, what's the purpose of this particular certificate? What are the fields that they're really going to examine? And am I satisfying those details? Okay. All right. So like I said, exercise 1, 2, and 3, those are the ones you want to get on. We're ahead of schedule, so don't sweat it, but there's not like a big stampede to get this done. But my goal is by the end of the week, we've got probably, I would say, I don't know, code signing I think will be next week. So the rest of them, I'd say we're looking to get done by the end of the week. Okay. For the next couple of days, I'd focus on 1 to 3. Certificate backups, I want to emphasize, I will do a lecture on that. But exercise 4 is performing a CA backup. The goal in that particular exercise is just to explore which backups actually do what, because they do different things. Okay. You can do a command line backup really quick, and it will save certain items and not others. You can do a Windows backup, and that will, depending what you do, if you do a system state, that will back up certain things and not others, right? So what we're doing is we're going to choose 3 different types of backups and change a few things in our CA configuration and then see which ones actually restore properly, okay, and which ones don't. Just so you know how effective it is to do certain tasks, certain types of backups. All right, I'm done. Now I'm chilling. Any questions?